This generation has no idea what that was like. These women would be, 100 women on a gutted second floor building, sewing buttons and pockets on garments in 100 degrees. They
Yeah.
would pass out and sew up their fingers because they were so exhausted. You're mentioning something that's also in my wheelhouse, I think, is that the importance of generations, that we're losing that in our society. In former societies, generations stood in the same place. And so you had 2 and 3 and sometimes 4 generations.
Yeah.
And even though in the wrong circumstances that could be oppressive, in the right circumstances, it was very important. It was
Yeah.
steadying. It gave stability, especially at a time when marriages tended to stay together. The family was very bonded.
Yes.
So your being around for your kids is hugely important.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's even important to the extent that you can to have grandparents around, or if not
Yes.
grandparents, then good mentors. Uh,
Yes. Yeah. I think we're in a global society now, and people are moving for jobs, and I don't think the same honor and respect is given to parents that
yeah,
we customarily did historically. Um, I think a lot of people in this generation are probably, with the incorporation of psychology, are at least more consciously angry and upset with their parents. Right? There's so much tension between adults and their, like geriatric parents, as they
yeah,
come to, they start to develop their own individual lives, their own autonomy, their own new attachment with spouses and friends, and then they don't need their parents in the same way emotionally anymore, and that frees them up to explore all the ways they were hurt through original sin as a
right,
child, and then this creates this tension.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's unfortunate. I think that's another thing that's been lost. Uh, I don't know if it's exclusive to my generation, but I don't, and maybe my socioeconomic status, because I grew up in very modest circumstances. My parents were very modest people, but I can
Yeah.
remember being disciplined by my dad for good reason from time to time. But I never resented him or hated him. I didn't like it. I
Hmm.
didn't like to get punished, but I realized how hard life. It was kind of like you were saying about what you see in your patients. When you see suffering in your patients, it relieves you if you can say, "Gee whiz, I wonder what it would be like to be them. That must be a very difficult place to be in." I
Yes.
could feel that as a young child with
Yes.
my dad because he was a laborer and he had a high IQ.
Yeah.
uh, Bryan. He was very, very smart. I gave him the Wexler. He went to 4 years of school. I gave him the Wexler when I was practicing the Wexler. He had
Yeah.
142 IQ. And I said,
Even with all the information that you have to retain, that
yeah,
usually that's transferred through school.
yeah.
Wow.
Well, he just read the encyclopedia himself. That's all. So everybody thought he was a college graduate.
Wow.
He was an immigrant laborer, but his jobs would be so hard that
Yeah.
I would see how much he sacrificed for us. And
Yeah.
so how could you be too angry with someone who does that? And
Resentful.
same with my mom. Um, I think that got lost now, and I think part of it is because parents and grandparents don't stay around, and so kids don't have a chance to see.
Yeah.
There's
Well,
also something else alarming that's going on. Is they do these studies. I don't know how valid they are, but generation millennials and to a greater extent Generation Z, they don't
yeah.
want to get married. They ask
No.
them, they just don't want to, and the idea of having kids is not exciting to them.
No, they
So
have
I rather,
dogs.
yeah,
They have
yeah,
dogs instead. Yeah.
yeah, and that's hard for me to relate to because the most beautiful thing you can do is have a kid. You know,
Well, I think it comes from a whole generation divorce. I remember when I was younger, there was this idea that there was such a thing as a good divorce, and it's fine. It'll be fine for the kids. It was amicable. The parents got along, and we shared time. There's no such thing as a good divorce. On some level, even if everyone is getting along with everyone, you learn about the nature of love from your parents. So you can learn love ends if your parents split up. There's so many unconscious messages that occur during childhood.
Right.
And so when it's a whole generation of kids who see all this divorce, all this infidelity, all like just the destruction of the family, it's actually, divorce rates are going down, but it's only because people aren't getting married in the first place.
Right. Right. Or getting married much later.
Yeah, getting married later, and then you can have less kids as a result because the biological clock with women.
It's alarming. Like in countries that were traditionally very Catholic, like France.
Yeah,
I'm interested in, obviously, in Italian culture, but also in French culture. I love French culture.
Yeah,
I think they've contributed so much to the world. They've learned the language along with Italian. But the French, nobody gets married in France anymore. It's sad. It's hardly anyone gets married.
Paris is the city of love.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Italy is kind of holding, at least with marriage, not necessarily. And I think they continue to identify with being Catholic by and large, but sometimes it's just pro forma Catholicism.
Yeah. Nominal Catholicism.
Yeah.
Now, I want to go back to something you said before about your parents and how hard your father worked and your mother worked, and you were never resentful of that because you saw that was the way in which they provided and expressed love in a certain sense. There was a book that came out not too long ago. It was called Bad Therapy. I don't know. Have you heard of this book, Bad Therapy?
No, I have not.
It was written by a journalist who is critiquing an entire generation of parenting, essentially. And she talked about how the Gen Z and the millennials, I might be extrapolating a little bit here. I might be interpreting a little bit, but the idea is that there's a lot of narcissism in the younger folks today because in the absence of parenting, like say during your years, or maybe a little bit later, there's been an overcompensation of engagement by the parents with the children. And it's almost like a lot of permissive parenting,
Right.
no limitations offered. They all become like little emperors. The children become like little emperors. They get whatever they want. With the affluence, they get whatever toys they want. There's no corporal punishment at all anymore. There's no physical discipline that goes on. And the result is you have a whole generation of people who can't. I mean, it's a far cry from the great generation of World War II. It's a generation of young people that have a very low threshold for suffering and difficulty, and essentially seeing other people. They only see themselves. I'm just interested to hear your commentary on that. Do you see like current generations as an overcorrection? I think a lot of people would hear what you said. A lot of modern parents would hear what you said about your parents working so much and not being around. And they might think, or even psychologists or therapists might think, well, that has to disrupt attachment. That has to disrupt attachment. So what's your comment on these swings and how engaged to be with children, how present and how to punish? And what do you think?
Well, they worked a lot, but they also were around. And my mom, believe it or not, worked in those sweatshops that they talk about. Where they, it was this generation has no idea what that was like. These women would be, 100 women on a gutted second floor building, sewing buttons and pockets on garments in 100 degrees. They would pass out and sew up their fingers because they were so exhausted.
Yeah.
And so my mom would do that in the evenings, but my dad would be home in the evenings. And then when he was working, she would be with us. And when they were with us, they were very present.
Yeah.
Very much so. Love that wouldn't quit. And discipline. My dad, because he was a laborer, his hands were so strong, he could take an apple and break it.
Yeah.
Break it in two.
Wow.
So he would never raise a hand to us because he didn't want to hurt us. But
Yeah.
he would just say things in Italian that would be threatening, and we go flying under the bed. You know, knowing that he had business. Not very often. Didn't have to discipline us very much.
You thought that was fine? You think that was healthy for your development?
And my grandparents, my mother's parents, everybody lived in tenement houses. So we started out in the basement, in basically a one-room apartment, next to these gigantic furnaces. My father had made a little extra money shoveling the coal in the furnaces to keep the whole place in heat. And my grandparents were right next door, my mother's parents. So you had their presence too. So there was all this support, this critical mass that keeps families together. People didn't have anything, and it's amazing how much they shared. They would have banquets and invite like all the neighbors.
Yeah.
Yeah. How did they do that? So that kind of gets through to you, and it gives you identity, as you probably well know. Here's my son, who's not in psychology, but is in finance. Yeah. But we think very much alike. We're both very math oriented. We're both really good at math, and we both like to look at patterns. And he said something to me that I never thought of that made sense. I said, I don't understand how I was the last of the silent generation. So you got Depression era, World War II parents, no nonsense parents. Right. If you got a job, you're lucky, and work hard and be honest. And your word is everything. Don't tell lies. This kind of thing. And then the baby boomers came along, and the baby boomers were exactly what you just described, because these guys were coming back from the war, and they were so happy to have survived that they overindulged these baby boomers. And they're the ones who got into drugs and all of that. Yeah. And so my son said, I said, how all three of you kids are close to the faith. You live good, solid lives. You gave us minor problems, never major. And he said, that's because, Dad, we were raised by your generation, and these millennials were raised by the baby boomers. And so his theory is, I don't know, probably an interesting research project, that it skips a generation, that the people that were solidly into basic values raised their kids that way. People that were indulged raised their kids with indulgence. The trick for our society is to get back. You can't dispense with basic values. No. St. Augustine and St. Thomas talked about that. They're essential. That's where the virtues come from. Good habits. Yes. Anyway, you got me preaching here.